Nobody saw this coming. Not Washington. Not the Gulf monarchies. Not the analysts who spent years mapping out the Middle East's most dangerous scenarios. A country fighting for its own survival. A country without a navy, without the resources of a superpower, without a seat at the table of the Persian Gulf, is now positioned to change the outcome of one of the most consequential maritime crises in modern history. Ukraine. The same Ukraine that was handed a death sentence by half the world's intelligence agencies in February 2022. The same Ukraine that was told to evacuate its president, pack up its government, and accept the inevitable. That Ukraine is now deploying specialists, drones, and battlefield-tested warfare doctrine to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that controls roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply. Let that sink in for a moment, because what we are witnessing is not just a tactical pivot. It is a strategic earthquake that is reshaping the entire architecture of global power, and almost nobody is talking about it with the gravity it deserves. The Strait of Hormuz has experienced ongoing geopolitical and economic disruption since February 28, 2026, following joint military strikes by the United States and Israel on Iran, which included the killing of Iran's supreme leader. Wikipedia Tehran's response was immediate, coordinated, and devastating in its economic impact, where Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps moved to blockade the strait, the narrow choke point through which a fifth of the world's oil flows every single day. Ships stopped moving, insurance premiums exploded, oil prices rocketed skyward, and the world held its breath, waiting for the United States, the most powerful military force in human history, to find an answer. Here is the uncomfortable truth that Washington has been slow to admit. The answer to this crisis was not sitting in a Pentagon war room. It was not on the deck of a U.S. aircraft carrier. The four-year war still raging in Ukraine suggests that even with thousands more U.S. forces heading for the region, no military force may be able to simply force the strait open through conventional means. CBS News. The reason for that assessment is profound, and it traces directly back to the lessons of the Black Sea. Lessons that Ukraine wrote in blood, ingenuity, and a kind of desperate creativity that only comes from having no other choice. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to February 24, 2022. The day Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world made a calculation. Russia had the Black Sea. Russia had a formidable fleet. Aging, yes, but capable. Ukraine had effectively no navy. Its only major warship, the Hetman Sahaidakhny, was scuttled at its berth to prevent it from falling into Russian hands. The situation at the start of the full-scale invasion was stark. Ukraine had one frigate and various gun-armed boats, nothing that could survive in open water against the Russians. The Black Sea could, without exaggeration, be described as a Russian lake. Russia and Russia used that dominance to blockade Ukrainian ports, choking off grain exports and threatening to starve economies as far away as North Africa and Southeast Asia. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary stories in modern military history, one that most people still do not fully understand. Ukraine did not accept the math. Instead, it rewrote the equation entirely. In a garage near the outskirts of Kiev, a group of engineers started building something that had never been done at scale before. Cheap, remotely operated naval drones, small, fast, and loaded with explosives. The birth of Ukraine's naval drones took place in a garage behind a country house near the edge of Kiev. In the spring of 2022, as fighting raged in the suburbs, a group of friends gathered to keep each other company, and then built a weapons system that would change the war. By October 2022, those garage-borne weapons were operational. The first recorded use of unmanned surface vehicles in combat by Ukraine against Russian forces was on October 29, 2022, in a multi-pronged attack on the Sevastopol naval base in Crimea, a port that had played a strategic role in Moscow's regional naval posture for generations. RSDI Russia's commanders barely had time to process what was happening. The attack featured swarms of surface and aerial drones deployed simultaneously, saturating Russian defenses faster than they could respond. The physical damage was limited. The psychological damage was immeasurable. For the first time, Russia's Black Sea Fleet realized it was vulnerable, and not to something it could easily counter. Then came the sinking of the Moskva. According to the New York Times, in mid-April 2022, U.S. and Ukrainian naval officers were on a routine intelligence sharing call when something unexpected appeared on their radar screens. The Americans had spotted the Moskva, Russia's Black Sea Fleet flagship. The Ukrainians thanked their counterparts for the information and excused themselves from the call. Soon after, the Ukrainians sank the Moskva. U.S. Naval Institute. It was the first Russian flagship sunk since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. The message to the Kremlin and to the world was unmistakable. The age of the untouchable Navy was over. Over the next 2 years, Ukraine executed one of the most remarkable asymmetric naval campaigns in history. Strike by strike, drone by drone, the picture changed completely. Ukraine used a combination of domestically developed naval drones and cruise missiles to decimate Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Ukrainian Navy officials claim they managed to damage or destroy around one-third of Putin's entire fleet, forcing the remaining Russian warships to retreat from occupied Crimea to ports in Russia itself. Atlantic Council. By spring 2024, Britain's defense ministry was calling the Russian Black Sea Fleet functionally inactive. Functionally inactive. One of the world's great naval powers had been neutralized, not by another superpower, but by a country that started the war with no navy at all. But the weapons Ukraine developed to achieve this were astonishingly cheap relative to what they destroyed. Produced at a cost of around $200,000 apiece, Ukraine's naval drones damaged or destroyed about 24 Russian warships, as much as a third of the Black Sea Fleet, including large landing ships and missile carriers worth billions of dollars. Time. The economics of that exchange are staggering. Ukraine was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to destroy assets worth hundreds of millions. And those same drones were evolving constantly. Magura V-5 drones armed with heat-seeking missiles shot down 2 Russian Mi-8 helicopters and damaged a third off the coast of Crimea, the first known case of a naval drone hitting aircraft. U.S. Naval Institute. The weapons were no longer just surface killers, and they were becoming multi-domain hunters. All of this matters enormously to what is now unfolding in the Persian Gulf, because Iran, watching closely, took careful notes on exactly how Ukraine had done it. Iran is taking a page right out of Ukraine's playbook when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is learning lessons of the war in Ukraine very carefully, said Yaroslav Trofimov, a Ukrainian-Italian author and chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, who covered the Ukraine war extensively. CBS News, the cheap drone, the saturation tactic, the asymmetric cost imposition. Tehran didn't just admire Ukraine's approach, it adopted it. And now the United States finds itself on the receiving end of a doctrine it helped finance and observe for 3 years in Ukraine, undeployed by a completely different adversary in a completely different ocean. The pattern is starting to look familiar. A vastly outgunned power using cheap tools and asymmetric tactics to thwart and frustrate a much better equipped adversary. Not even needing to win outright. but just raise the risk level of any movement in the war zone. CBS News. The Strait of Hormuz and the Black Sea are very different bodies of water. But the strategic logic is identical. Control through denial, victory through disruption, power through chaos. Iran does not need to destroy the U.S. Navy. It only needs to make passage through the strait expensive enough, dangerous enough, and unpredictable enough that the global economy bleeds. And right now, it is succeeding. This is where Ukraine's role becomes absolutely extraordinary. And this is the part that almost nobody expected. Ukraine's low-cost drone defense technology is suddenly in high demand. As masses of low-cost Iranian drones have caused havoc across the Gulf, hitting oil infrastructure and U.S. bases, Ukraine has become the world's unlikely arsenal for fighting back. Time. The irony is almost too sharp to process. The same Iranian Shahed drones that Russia has been raining down on Kyiv for years, drones that Ukraine spent thousands of hours learning to intercept, jam, and destroy, are now the primary weapon Iran is using against the Gulf states and global shipping. And Ukraine has the institutional knowledge, the operators, the doctrine, and the hardware to counter them. Nobody else does at this scale. Nobody. Ukraine's specialists have a PhD in anti-drone warfare, according to Patricia Bazilchik, our Associate Director and Associate Fellow with the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. csmonitor.com. That is not a metaphor. Ukraine has spent 4 years developing, testing, and refining counter-drone systems under live fire conditions. Conditions that no training exercise anywhere in the world can replicate. Ukrainian officials state that the country produced over 100,000 interceptor drones in 2025 alone, with combat success rates exceeding 60%. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense also reported deliveries approaching 950 anti-Shahed interceptors per day in December 2025. Center for Strategic and International Studies, 950 interceptors per day. That is not a niche capability. That is an industrial pipeline for modern warfare. One that is now being redirected, in part, toward the Gulf. The cost mathematics here are brutal and unavoidable. Iran's Shahed drones are estimated to cost roughly $20,000 to $50,000 each, but intercepting them with advanced air defense missiles often costs millions of dollars. A single Patriot interceptor can cost around $3 million to $4 million per launch, creating a stark cost imbalance when used against relatively inexpensive drones. Time. That is the trap. That is the vice that Iran has engineered. You can have the best air defense money can buy, and you can still bleed out economically just by having to fire it repeatedly against a swarm of cheap munitions. Ukraine solved this problem. Interceptor drones used in Ukraine typically cost $2,000 to $4,000, allowing threats to be engaged at a fraction of the cost of traditional interceptors, such as the Patriot missile. The Center for Strategic and International Studies. $2,000 against a $4 million Patriot interceptor. The arithmetic changes everything. Now step back and consider what Zelensky has engineered here. His country is still at war. Russian missiles are still falling on Ukrainian cities. The front lines are still active. And yet, Ukrainian officials are helping 5 countries in the Middle East and Gulf region counter attacks on their territory by Iranian drones. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Jordan. Ukraine is also looking into whether it can play a role in restoring security in the Strait of Hormuz. PBS. This is not charity. This is not altruism in the abstract. This is one of the most sophisticated pieces of wartime diplomacy in decades, and Zelensky is executing it from a position that most world leaders would consider impossible. Zelensky said that Ukraine has already signed 10-year security agreements with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and expects to shortly finalize a similar agreement with the UAE. Ukraine has never had such agreements with this region before. Fortune 10-year security agreements with Gulf monarchies, from a country that started this decade being told it might not survive the month. The geopolitical reversal is staggering. According to Zelensky, Ukraine has already deployed 228 specialists to intercept Shahed drones in Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Jordan. Ukrainian specialists deployed in Middle Eastern countries have already used interceptor drones to shoot down several Iranian-made Shahed attack drones. Militarily, these are not advisors sitting in air-conditioned offices offering PowerPoint presentations. They are operators active in the field, under real conditions, against the same weapon system they have spent years countering. And they are proving it works. The broader strategic picture here is one that should be making planners in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran deeply uncomfortable. Ukraine, a country that Western analysts frequently describe as dependent on foreign support, has just demonstrated that it possesses a capability that the wealthiest and most powerful alliance in history cannot fully replicate on its own timetable. The United States can escort ships. It can launch airstrikes. It can threaten, but it cannot cheaply, rapidly, and effectively saturate drone defense across an entire maritime theater the way Ukraine can. The key lesson from Ukraine's experience is that defending against mass drone attacks requires mass on the defensive side as well. The U.S. military must field large numbers of cheap interceptor drones as a first defensive layer. Center for Strategic and International Studies. That lesson is being applied in the Gulf right now, by Ukraine, not by the Pentagon. Then there are the naval dimensions. Ukraine has offered sea drones as part of its contribution to the Strait of Hormuz security architecture. Zelensky framed Ukraine's experience keeping shipping lanes in the Black Sea open as a direct component of the Gulf deals. And Ukraine will apparently offer sea drones as part of its defense of the shipping corridor in the Persian Gulf. The Kyiv Independent. This is not a hypothetical. This is a formal offer backed by 4 years of proven battlefield performance. The same Sea Baby platforms that chased Russia's Black Sea Fleet out of Crimea, the same Magura 55S that shot down helicopters and stalked submarines, are now potentially heading for the most economically critical waterway on the planet. The United Kingdom is even considering deploying Ukrainian British Octopus anti-aircraft drones to protect ships in the Strait of Hormuz from Iranian attacks, a system that thousands are produced of every month. Primarily for Ukraine's own defense. Militarily, we need to talk about what this means for Russia, because Moscow is watching this play out with a combination of fury and dread. Russia has spent years trying to exhaust Ukraine, economically, militarily, diplomatically. And now Ukraine is using that exhaustion as a marketing campaign. Every Shahed drone that Russia fired at Kyiv was, in retrospect, an advertisement for Ukraine's counter-drone technology. Every night Ukraine's defenders lit up the sky above their cities to intercept Russian drones. They were building a live-fire resume that no defense contractor on Earth could replicate in a laboratory.